I am Rebecca, 28 years old, and for 3 years I endured being told I wasn't good enough for their precious son. Then my divorce lawyer father walked into their living room, and everything changed. What happened next turned their smugness into sheer panic. But before I tell you how one phone call shifted the entire power dynamic, let me know where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up in Charleston, South Carolina, I was raised by a single father who built his reputation as one of the most feared divorce attorneys in the state. Dad didn't just win cases, he dismantled opposing arguments with surgical precision, leaving no stone unturned when it came to protecting his clients' interests. Thomas Mitchell was a name whispered in country club circles and boardrooms alike, not because people feared him personally, but because they feared what he could do in a courtroom. My childhood was spent listening to Dad's stories over dinner about cases he'd won, assets he'd protected, and prenups he'd crafted that were tighter than Fort Knox. He taught me early that knowledge was power, that documentation was everything, and that understanding your worth meant never accepting less than you deserved. These lessons would prove invaluable later, though I never imagined I'd need them in my own marriage. I met David Hartwell during my senior year at the College of Charleston, where I was studying marketing with a minor in psychology. He was completing his MBA, 2 years older than me, with the kind of confident charm that made him popular in every social circle. David came from what people in the South called good family. The Hartwells owned a chain of luxury car dealerships across 3 states, lived in a sprawling plantation-style mansion in the historic district, and had the kind of generational wealth that came with expectations and traditions. Our courtship was whirlwind and romantic. David was attentive, thoughtful, and seemed genuinely interested in my dreams of starting my own marketing consultancy. He would pick me up in his BMW, take me to expensive restaurants, and talk about our future together with such certainty that I found myself caught up in his vision. When he proposed after 18 months of dating, with a 3-carat diamond ring at sunset on Folly Beach, I said yes without hesitation. The engagement period should have been my first warning about what lay ahead. While David remained loving and supportive, his family's reaction to our engagement was lukewarm at best. His mother, Patricia Hartwell, was a woman who had never worked a day in her life, but somehow felt qualified to judge everyone else's career choices and social standing. She was the type of Southern belle who smiled sweetly while delivering cutting remarks, always prefaced with, "Bless your heart," to soften the blow. His father, William Hartwell, was more direct in his disapproval. A man who measured worth by bank account balances and family lineage, he made it clear that he had expected David to marry within their social circle. Someone from a family they knew, someone whose father owned businesses rather than worked for other people, as he dismissively referred to my dad's law practice. The fact that my father was actually quite successful and well-respected seemed irrelevant to William's outdated class distinctions. David's sister, Caroline, was perhaps the worst of them all. 3 years younger than David and spoiled beyond belief, she had never faced a consequence in her life. Caroline made snide comments about my clothes, my hair, my car, and my background, always with David conveniently out of earshot. She would suggest wedding vendors that were more our family's style, and make remarks about how different our wedding would be from what she had always imagined for her brother. The extended family wasn't much better. David's aunts would ask pointed questions about my family's people, wanting to know which families we were connected to, which country club my parents had belonged to, and what kind of society events I had attended growing up. When I explained that my parents had divorced when I was young and that my mother had moved to California, leaving me to be raised by my father, the looks of pity mixed with judgment were unmistakable. Despite these red flags, I pressed forward with the wedding planning, believing that once we were married, his family would warm up to me. David assured me constantly that his family just needed time to get to know me, that they were protective because they loved him, and that everything would smooth over once we tied the knot. I wanted to believe him, and perhaps more importantly, I was already deeply in love with the man I thought he was. Our wedding was held at the Hartwell family estate, a decision I later regretted but agreed to at the time because it seemed important to David. The planning process was a masterclass in passive-aggressive manipulation. Patricia would make suggestions that weren't really suggestions, like insisting we use her family's florist because they understand our aesthetic, or recommending we serve specific menu items because that's what the Hartwell family has always done. When I showed enthusiasm for ideas that differed from their traditions, Caroline would laugh and say something like, "Oh, Rebecca, that's so creative, but we're trying to maintain a certain elegance." The implication was clear. My ideas weren't elegant enough for their standards. David, when I brought these concerns to him, would minimize them as wedding stress and assure me that everyone just wanted the day to be perfect. The wedding itself was beautiful, I'll admit. The gardens were immaculate, the weather was perfect, and David looked handsome in his custom tuxedo. But throughout the entire day, I felt like a performer in someone else's production, rather than a bride celebrating her own wedding. During the reception, Patricia gave a toast that managed to welcome me to the family, while simultaneously emphasizing how lucky I was to be marrying into such an established family with such deep roots in Charleston society. The honeymoon to Italy was blissful, a 2-week escape where it was just David and me, away from family pressures and expectations. We talked about our future, our dreams, and how we would build our life together. David was supportive of my business aspirations, and even helped me brainstorm names for my future marketing consultancy. For those 2 weeks, I felt like I had married my best friend and partner. Reality hit hard when we returned to Charleston and moved into the house David had purchased in the same exclusive neighborhood where his parents lived. Suddenly, Patricia was dropping by unannounced to see how we're settling in, and to offer decorating advice that was really thinly veiled criticism of my choices. She would rearrange items on my coffee table and suggest I might want to register for better china patterns since, quote, David is used to a certain quality. Caroline became a constant presence as well, often inviting herself over for dinner or asking David to help her with various projects that always seemed to require his immediate attention. When I suggested that maybe we needed some space as newlyweds to establish our own routines, David accused me of being jealous of his close relationship with his sister and reminded me that family was important to him. The comments about my worthiness began subtly. Patricia would make remarks about how different I was from the girls David had dated in college, girls from families they knew who, quote, understood the responsibilities that come with the Hartwell name. She would suggest I might want to join certain charitable organizations or social clubs, not because she thought I'd enjoy them, but because appearances matter in David's position. William was more blunt in his assessments. During family dinners, he would make comments about people who married up and how important it was for them to rise to the occasion, rather than bringing down the family's standing. When I started my marketing,
preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Consultancy, 6 months after the wedding, he questioned why I needed to work when David made good money, suggesting that a proper wife focused on supporting her husband's career, rather than pursuing her own ambitions. The breaking point in my tolerance for their behavior came during our first Christmas as a married couple. The Hartwells had a tradition of elaborate Christmas Eve gatherings with extended family and business associates. I spent weeks preparing, buying thoughtful gifts for everyone, and even commissioning a custom piece of art featuring the family estate as a gift for Patricia and William. When Christmas Eve arrived, I was excited to be included in this important family tradition. I wore a beautiful black dress that I had splurged on, wanting to look perfect for the occasion. The evening started pleasantly enough, with David introducing me to family friends and business associates as his wife. I felt like maybe I was finally being accepted into their circle. But as the evening progressed, the subtle digs began. Patricia introduced me to people as, quote, David's wife Rebecca, who's trying to start some kind of little business. When people asked about my work, Caroline would interrupt with comments like, Rebecca thinks she's going to revolutionize marketing in Charleston, in a tone that made it clear she found the idea amusing. The worst moment came when David's elderly great-aunt, Margaret, pulled me aside for what I thought would be a nice conversation. Instead, she looked me up and down critically and said, You know, dear, we all hope you understand what you've gotten yourself into. The Hartwell men have always married women who complement their status, not women who need to be elevated to it. I hope you're prepared to grow into the role. I stood there stunned, not knowing how to respond to such a direct insult. When I told David about it later that evening, he dismissed it as, quote, being old-fashioned, and suggested I was being too sensitive. That was the moment I realized David wasn't going to defend me against his family's treatment. He was either oblivious to it or, worse, complicit in it. The pattern continued throughout our first year of marriage. Family dinners where I was ignored or patronized. Social events where Patricia would make comments about my dress choices or remind me to smile more because people are watching. Business functions where William would introduce me as David's wife without mentioning my name, as if my identity was entirely subsumed by my marital status. My marketing consultancy was thriving despite their dismissive attitude. I had landed several significant clients and was building a reputation for innovative digital marketing strategies. But instead of celebrating my success, the Hartwell family seemed threatened by it. Patricia would make comments about how demanding my work seemed, and how it must be difficult for David to have a wife who was always focused on business. The criticism became more pointed as my business grew. Carolyn started making remarks about how I was too ambitious for my own good, and how successful marriages required balance and priorities. William would question David about whether my work was affecting our family planning, as if my career ambitions were somehow preventing us from having children immediately. David's response to all of this was consistently disappointing. When I brought up specific incidents of his family's behavior, he would minimize them or suggest I was misinterpreting their intentions. He claimed they were just protective, and that they needed time to adjust to having someone new in the family. When I pointed out that they had never treated his ex-girlfriends this way, he insisted that was different because we weren't serious about getting married then. The gaslighting was subtle but constant. David would claim he didn't hear the comments his mother made, or that I was being overly sensitive about his sister's behavior. When I suggested we spend holidays with my father's side of the family or create our own traditions, David accused me of trying to isolate him from his family, and reminded me how important family loyalty was to him. By our second year of marriage, I felt like I was living a double life. At work, I was confident, successful, and respected. Clients sought out my expertise, and I was building something meaningful with my consultancy. But at home and at family events, I felt diminished, criticized, and constantly on guard against the next subtle insult or passive-aggressive comment. The situation reached a new low during David's birthday celebration. Patricia had planned an elaborate dinner party at their estate, inviting David's college friends, business associates, and extended family. I had been looking forward to the event, hoping that in the celebratory atmosphere, I might finally feel included and welcomed. I spent considerable time and money finding the perfect gift for David, a vintage watch from an auction house that I knew he had been admiring. I also brought a beautiful bottle of wine for Patricia and William as hosts. I wore a sophisticated navy dress that I felt confident in and arrived ready to celebrate my husband's special day. The evening started well enough. David seemed happy with his gift and made a point of showing it to several guests. But as the night progressed, I began to notice the familiar pattern of exclusion. Conversations would pause when I approached, then resume in directions that didn't include me. When I tried to contribute to discussions about business or current events, my comments were acknowledged briefly before the conversation moved on without me. The most humiliating moment came during David's toast. As family and friends gathered around, William raised his glass and began speaking about David's accomplishments, his character, and his future potential. He talked about the pride the Hartwell family felt in David's success and how they looked forward to watching him continue the family legacy. Then William's tone shifted slightly as he acknowledged the changes in David's life over the past 2 years. He spoke about marriage as a, quote, learning experience, and how important it was for young couples to, quote, grow together in understanding their roles and responsibilities. The implication was clear. I was the one who needed to learn and grow, not David. But the real blow came when William raised his glass for the final toast. To David, he said, looking directly at me as he spoke, "May you always remember your worth and never settle for less than you deserve in any aspect of your life." The message was unmistakable, delivered with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I was the less than that David was settling for. The room fell silent for a moment before erupting in applause and cheers. David, either oblivious to his father's meaning or choosing to ignore it, smiled and thanked everyone for coming. I stood there with my wine glass, feeling like I had been slapped in front of 40 people. none of whom seemed surprised by William's comment. Later that night, when I tried to discuss what had happened with David, he insisted I had misunderstood his father's words. He claimed the toast was meant to be encouraging and motivational, not insulting. When I pointed out that William had looked directly at me while making the comment about settling for less, David accused me of being paranoid and looking for problems where none existed. That night, lying in bed next to my husband, who refused to acknowledge what his family was doing to me, I realized that this pattern was never going to change. The Hartwells had decided I wasn't good enough for their son, and they were going to continue making that clear until either I left or I was completely broken down by their treatment. I had two choices: continue accepting their abuse and hope that someday they would change their minds about me, or find a way to stand up for myself that they couldn't dismiss or ignore. As I lay there thinking about my father's stories about difficult negotiations and impossible clients, an idea began to form in my mind. Dad had always taught me that the key to winning any conflict was preparation, documentation, and understanding your opponent's weaknesses. The Hartwells thought they held all the power in this situation because of their money and social position, but they had made one critical error in their assessment of me. They had no idea who my father was or what he was capable of. Thomas Mitchell hadn't built his reputation by backing down from intimidation or accepting unacceptable behavior from anyone, regardless of their social standing. And he certainly hadn't raised his daughter to tolerate being treated as less than worthy by anyone, including her husband's family. The next morning, I called my father's office and scheduled a lunch meeting. It was time to have a very important conversation about marriage, respect, and what happened when people underestimated the Mitchell family. The Hartwells were about to learn that their assumptions about my background and my family's capabilities were not just wrong, they were dangerously miscalculated. As I sat in my car outside Dad's law office, looking up at the brass nameplate that read, Mitchell and Associates, Family Law, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in months. The little girl who had grown up listening to stories about justice and standing up for what's right was about to remind some very arrogant people that respect isn't determined by bank account balances or family names. It's earned through character and given through choice. And the Hartwell family was about to discover that their choice to disrespect me had consequences they never saw coming. Walking into my father's law office felt like stepping into a sanctuary I had forgotten existed. The familiar scent of leather-bound books and expensive cologne mixed with coffee created an atmosphere of power and precision that I had taken for granted growing up. Dad's secretary, Mrs. Chen, who had known me since I was a toddler, greeted me with the warm smile she reserved for family and directed me to his private office. Thomas Mitchell stood as I entered, his 6-foot frame commanding attention even in the comfortable space of his own office. At 55, my father maintained the sharp appearance that had intimidated opposing counsel for decades. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his charcoal suit was tailored to perfection, and his eyes held the keen intelligence that had made him legendary in Charleston's legal circles. Dad embraced me warmly, before gesturing to the leather chairs positioned near the windows overlooking the historic district. This wasn't his formal conference area where he met with clients. This was the comfortable corner where he had helped me with homework as a child, and where we had shared countless conversations about life, relationships, and the importance of standing up for oneself. As I settled into the familiar chair, Dad poured coffee from the elegant service set that had been a gift from a grateful client years ago. He studied my face with the practiced eye of someone who had spent decades reading people's emotions and motivations. Without saying a word, he seemed to understand that this wasn't a casual father-daughter lunch. I began by telling him about the pattern of behavior I had been experiencing with the Hartwell family. As I spoke, I watched his expression shift from paternal concern to professional interest, to something that looked remarkably like controlled anger. Dad had always been protective of me, but he was also a man who understood power dynamics and manipulation better than most. When I described William's toast at David's birthday party, particularly the comment about David never settling for less than he deserved while looking directly at me, Dad's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He asked me to repeat the exact words, and I could see him filing away every detail in the methodical way that had made him so successful in the courtroom. Dad asked probing questions about David's response to his family's behavior, about the financial arrangements in our marriage, and about any documentation I might have of the incidents I was describing. When I mentioned that I had been keeping a journal of particularly hurtful comments and situations, partly as a way to process my feelings, and partly because some instinct told me to document what was happening, his approval was evident. He listened without interruption as I explained how isolated I felt, how David's refusal to acknowledge or address his family's treatment was affecting our marriage, and how I was beginning to question my own perceptions because of their consistent gaslighting. When I finished speaking, Dad was quiet for several moments, his fingers steepled as he considered everything I had shared. Finally, he spoke with the measured tone I remembered from my childhood when he was about to deliver an important lesson. He explained that what I was experiencing had a name in his professional world: psychological abuse, through systematic devaluation and isolation. The fact that it was coming from in-laws rather than a spouse directly didn't make it less damaging or more acceptable. Dad outlined several concerning patterns he was hearing in my story. The deliberate exclusion from conversations and social interactions was a classic technique used to undermine someone's confidence and sense of belonging. The constant criticism disguised as concern or tradition was designed to make me doubt my own worth and judgment. Most troubling of all was David's refusal to acknowledge or address the behavior, which suggested either willful blindness or active participation in the mistreatment. He asked me point-blank what outcome I was hoping for from our conversation. Did I want his advice on how to handle the situation diplomatically? Was I looking for strategies to improve my relationship with David's family? Or was I beginning to question whether this marriage was sustainable given the circumstances and David's unwillingness to protect me from his family's behavior? The question forced me to confront thoughts I had been avoiding for months. I admitted that I wasn't sure the situation could be salvaged, especially given David's consistent pattern of minimizing and dismissing my concerns. I told Dad that I felt like I was losing myself in trying to accommodate people who had no intention of ever accepting me, and that I was beginning to understand why he had always emphasized the importance of surrounding myself with people who valued and respected me. Dad nodded slowly, then asked a question that surprised me. Did I want him to meet the Hartwell family? Not as my father coming to a social gathering, but as Thomas Mitchell, attorney, coming to assess a situation that was affecting his daughter's well-being. He explained that sometimes people needed to understand the full picture of who they were dealing with before they could make informed decisions about their behavior. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying. I knew what my father was capable of in professional settings. I had seen him reduce opposing counsel to stammering apologies and watched him dissect weak arguments with surgical precision. But this was my marriage, my life, and I wasn't sure I was ready for the nuclear option that involving Dad professionally might represent. He assured me that his involvement would be proportional and strategic. He wasn't suggesting we immediately pursue legal action or threaten divorce proceedings. Instead, he was offering to help level the playing field by ensuring the Hartwell family understood that their behavior had been noticed and documented by someone with the knowledge and resources to address it appropriately if necessary. We discussed the timing and approach carefully. Dad suggested that the most effective strategy would be for him to attend a family gathering where he could observe the behavior I had described firsthand and, if necessary, make it clear that their treatment of me was unacceptable. He explained that people who used psychological manipulation tactics often backed down when confronted by someone who understood their methods and wasn't intimidated by their social or financial status. The opportunity presented itself sooner than expected. David mentioned that his parents were hosting their annual spring garden party the following weekend, a lavish affair that attracted Charleston's social elite and business community. It was exactly the kind of event where the Hartwell family would be performing their public roles as pillars of society, while continuing their private campaign to undermine me. I casually mentioned to David that my father was in town for the weekend and asked if he might be able to join us at the garden party. David, who had met Dad only briefly at our wedding and knew him simply as Rebecca's father who practices law, readily agreed. He even seemed pleased at the prospect of introducing Dad to his family's social circle, likely seeing it as an opportunity to help me fit in better with their crowd. Patricia, when David mentioned that my father would be attending, made the expected politely enthusiastic noises about looking forward to getting to know him better. I could practically hear her mental calculations about how to incorporate my father into her social assessments, and whether his presence might somehow reflect positively or negatively on their family's status. As the garden party approached, I found myself feeling a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. Part of me was excited at the prospect of having an ally in my corner, someone who understood manipulation tactics and wouldn't be swayed by the Hartwell family's charm offensive. But another part of me worried about the potential consequences of escalating the situation rather than continuing to try to work things out quietly. Dad and I met for coffee the morning of the party to discuss strategy and observations he should watch for. He explained that he would spend the first part of the event simply observing the family dynamics and how I was treated in social settings. He would note conversation patterns, body language, and any subtle forms of exclusion or manipulation that occurred naturally during the gathering. He assured me that his initial approach would be entirely professional and cordial. He would introduce himself as Thomas Mitchell, mention his law practice in casual conversation, and gauge the family's reaction to learning more about his background and professional reputation. Only if he witnessed unacceptable behavior toward me would he consider a more direct intervention. The garden party was held on the immaculately maintained grounds of the Hartwell estate, with white tents, elegant floral arrangements, and a string quartet providing background music. The guest list included prominent business leaders, political figures, and Charleston's old money families. It was exactly the kind of event where the Hartwells could showcase their social connections and community standing. Dad arrived looking impeccable in a navy blazer and khakis, the perfect outfit for a Charleston spring gathering. His confidence was evident in every step as he approached the receiving line, where Patricia and William greeted guests. I watched from a distance as David introduced my father to his parents, noting their politely interested expressions as they exchanged pleasantries. Patricia's demeanor was her usual gracious hostess performance, welcoming Dad warmly and expressing delight at finally having the opportunity to spend time with Rebecca's family. William was cordially professional, asking general questions about Dad's work and making the expected comments about the legal profession. Neither seemed particularly concerned about Dad's presence or professional background at this initial meeting. As the afternoon progressed, I watched Dad circulate through the party with the natural ease of someone comfortable in any social setting. He spoke knowledgeably about a variety of topics, from Charleston's history to current political developments, demonstrating the breadth of knowledge that had made him successful in his career. Several guests sought him out for conversation, clearly impressed by his intelligence and engaging personality. Meanwhile, the familiar patterns of behavior toward me began almost immediately. Patricia guided me around the party, introducing me to guests with comments like, "This is our daughter-in-law Rebecca who has some kind of marketing business," or "Rebecca is still learning about our family traditions and community involvement." The subtle undermining was present in every introduction, making me seem like an outsider still trying to find her place. Caroline was particularly active in her usual performance of sisterly concern, mixed with subtle criticism. She commented on my dress choice, suggesting it was very bold for a family gathering, and made remarks about how different this crowd was from what I was probably used to. When guests asked about my business, Caroline would interrupt with comments about how demanding entrepreneurship could be, and how it was so hard to balance everything when you're trying to establish yourself. Dad observed these interactions with the trained eye of someone who had spent decades recognizing manipulation and power dynamics. I could see him taking mental notes as Patricia steered conversations away from my professional accomplishments, and as Caroline consistently redirected attention away from me whenever I tried to contribute meaningfully to discussions. The most revealing moment came when William began holding court near the bar, regaling a group of business associates with stories about David's success and potential. As I approached the group, hoping to join the conversation about my husband's achievements, William smoothly shifted the discussion in a direction that excluded me entirely. When one of the guests asked about David's recent promotion and how his wife felt about the additional responsibilities, William answered for me before I could speak. He explained that young wives often needed time to understand the demands of serious business careers, and that the Hartwell family had always prioritized supporting their men's professional advancement above all else. Dad, who had positioned himself within earshot of this conversation, watched as I was systematically excluded from a discussion about my own husband's career. When I attempted to add a comment about being proud of David's work and supportive of his ambitions, William acknowledged my statement with a patronizing smile before immediately returning to his conversation with the men in the group. This pattern continued throughout the afternoon. Every time I tried to engage in substantive conversation, I was either ignored, interrupted, or redirected to topics deemed more appropriate for my participation. Discussions about business, politics, or community development were clearly considered beyond my understanding or interest, while conversations about charity work, home decoration, or social events were where my contributions were tolerated. Dad later told me that watching this systematic exclusion and condescension was like observing a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The Hartwell family had perfected the art of making someone feel unwelcome and inadequate, while maintaining plausible deniability about their intentions. Any individual incident could be dismissed as a misunderstanding or social awkwardness, but the cumulative effect was devastating to the target's confidence and sense of belonging. The turning point came during the formal portion of the afternoon, when William called for everyone's attention to make an announcement about a new business venture David would be leading. As the family gathered together for photographs and toasts, I found myself positioned at the edge of the group, clearly included in the physical gathering but somehow outside the emotional circle of celebration. Patricia orchestrated the positioning for the photographer, ensuring that immediate family members were prominently featured while I was placed in a location that suggested my peripheral importance to the family unit. When William raised his glass to toast David's success and the family's pride in his accomplishments, his words carefully emphasized David's individual achievements and the support of his loving family, without any specific acknowledgement of my role as his wife. Dad watched this entire performance from his position among the other guests, and I could see his expression growing more serious as he witnessed the subtle but systematic way I was being marginalized at my own husband's celebration. When David accepted congratulations from family and friends, he seemed oblivious to the way his family had positioned me as an observer rather than a participant in his success. After the formal toasts concluded and guests returned to mingling, Dad approached William and Patricia with what appeared to be casual social conversation. I watched from across the garden as he introduced himself more thoroughly, mentioning his law practice and some of his more notable cases. The change in the Hartwells' demeanor was immediate and noticeable. William's posture straightened as he realized he was speaking with Thomas Mitchell, the divorce attorney whose reputation preceded him throughout Charleston's business and social communities. Patricia's smile became more fixed as Dad casually mentioned some of his recent high-profile cases involving complex asset division and family business disputes. Dad later recounted their conversation for me, explaining how he had skillfully woven information about his professional specialties into seemingly casual social chat. He mentioned his expertise in cases involving marital assets, business valuations, and family dynamics that affected legal proceedings. Without making any direct threats or accusations, he had managed to convey that he was someone who understood family dynamics very well and had the professional tools to address problematic situations when necessary. The effect on William and Patricia was exactly what Dad had anticipated. They realized they were no longer dealing with just Rebecca's father, but with one of Charleston's most formidable family law attorneys, someone who had the knowledge, experience, and professional reputation to make their lives very complicated if they continued their current behavior toward his daughter. During this conversation, Dad also casually mentioned his pride in my business success and his respect for David's intelligence in recognizing and supporting my entrepreneurial talents. He spoke about the importance of mutual respect in strong marriages and how impressed he was with the partnership David and I had built together. The message was clear. He saw me as an accomplished professional deserving of respect, not as someone who needed to prove her worth to anyone. As the afternoon continued, I noticed a marked change in how the family interacted with me. Patricia began including me more directly in conversations and making more positive comments about my contributions to discussions. Caroline's subtle criticisms stopped entirely, replaced by neutral or even occasionally complimentary remarks. William began acknowledging my presence and opinions in ways that hadn't happened since the early days of my relationship with David. The transformation was remarkable and somewhat surreal. The same people who had spent 2 years systematically undermining my confidence and sense of belonging were suddenly treating me with the courtesy and respect that should have been baseline expectations from the beginning. It was both validating and deeply sad to realize that their behavior had nothing to do with my actual worth or character, and everything to do with their perception of the consequences they might face for treating me poorly. David noticed the change but seemed genuinely puzzled by it. When I mentioned later that his family had been more welcoming than usual, he expressed relief that we were finally making progress in our relationships with his parents and sister. He didn't seem to connect the shift in their behavior with my father's presence or their conversation about his professional background. As the party wound down, Dad approached me to say goodbye, giving me a warm hug and telling me how much he had enjoyed meeting David's family and seeing their beautiful home. In front of the Hartwells, he mentioned that he looked forward to many future gatherings and hoped we would all have opportunities to spend more time together getting to know each other better. The drive home was quiet, with David commenting on what a nice time everyone seemed to have had and how well my father had fit in with his family's social circle. He mentioned that his parents had been impressed with Dad's intelligence and professional success, and that they had expressed interest in inviting us to future family events where Dad might be able to join us. That evening, as David showered and prepared for bed, I reflected on the day's events and their implications. The respect I had been shown after Dad's conversation with his parents felt hollow because it was conditional on their fear of consequences, rather than genuine recognition of my worth. I realized that my value in their eyes was determined entirely by external factors: my father's professional reputation and potential ability to cause them problems, rather than my own character, accomplishments, or role as David's wife. Dad called me the next morning to discuss his observations and recommendations. He confirmed that what he had witnessed was a textbook example of systematic psychological manipulation designed to undermine my confidence and sense of belonging in the family. He explained that people who engaged in this behavior typically did so because they felt threatened by something about their target, whether it was intelligence, independence, or potential influence over family dynamics. In my case, Dad believed the Hartwell family's behavior stemmed from their need to maintain control over David and their family narrative. My independence, professional success, and strong relationship with my father represented potential threats to their ability to dictate family decisions and maintain their preferred power dynamics. By undermining my confidence and isolating me from support systems, they had hoped to ensure I would never challenge their authority or influence over David. Dad's assessment of David's role in the situation was particularly difficult to hear but necessary for me to understand. He explained that David's consistent refusal to acknowledge or address his family's behavior was not ignorance or conflict avoidance, but a form of complicity that enabled their mistreatment to continue. Whether conscious or unconscious, David was choosing his family's comfort over my well-being and dignity. The conversation with Dad forced me to confront some hard truths about my marriage and my future. I could continue accepting the conditional respect that came from my father's implied protection, knowing that it could disappear as quickly as it had appeared if circumstances changed. Or I could recognize that a marriage requiring external enforcement of basic respect and dignity was fundamentally flawed and unsustainable. Dad offered to continue his involvement at whatever level one felt was appropriate. He could maintain a visible presence in my life that would deter future mistreatment, or he could step back and allow me to handle the situation using the tools and confidence he had helped me develop. Most importantly, he assured me that whatever decisions I made about my marriage and my future, I would have his complete support and all the resources he could provide. As I considered my options, I realized that the garden party had been more than just a successful intervention in my immediate situation. It had been a revelation about the kind of relationship I deserved, and the kind of partner I needed. David's failure to protect me from his family's behavior, his inability to recognize their mistreatment even when it was pointed out to him, and his willingness to gaslight me rather than confront uncomfortable truths about his family had shown me exactly where I stood in his priorities. The temporary improvement in the Hartwell family's behavior felt like a band-aid on a deeper wound. They had demonstrated that they were capable of treating me with respect when they feared consequences for their actions, but they had also shown that they had no intention of changing their fundamental attitudes toward me without external pressure. More importantly, David had shown me that he was either unable or unwilling to be the partner I needed him to be. A husband who truly valued and protected his wife wouldn't have required his father-in-law's professional reputation to enforce basic courtesy toward her. A man who genuinely respected his partner would have addressed his family's behavior long before it escalated, to the point where outside intervention became necessary. As I sat in my home office that night, looking at the marketing materials for my thriving business and thinking about the confident, successful woman I was in my professional life, I realized how much I had compromised myself trying to fit into a family that had never intended to accept me. The contrast between who I was at work and who I had become in my marriage was stark and unsustainable. The next few weeks would test whether the changes in the Hartwell family's behavior were sustainable or merely temporary responses to perceived threat. More importantly, they would reveal whether David was capable of growth and genuine partnership, or whether he would revert to his established patterns of minimizing my concerns and prioritizing his family's comfort over our marriage. I had always believed that love could overcome differences, and that patience and understanding could heal family rifts. But Dad's intervention had shown me the difference between problems that could be solved through communication and effort, and fundamental incompatibilities that no amount of love could bridge. The question now was whether I had the courage to act on that knowledge and make the difficult decisions that my newfound clarity was pointing toward. The temporary peace that followed the garden party lasted exactly 3 weeks. During that time, Patricia's phone calls were polite, Carolyn's visits were respectful, and William actually acknowledged my business accomplishments during a family dinner. But underneath the surface politeness, I could sense the resentment building like pressure in a sealed container. The facade cracked during a dinner at the Hartwell estate when David announced that my marketing consultancy had been selected to handle a significant campaign for a major Charleston hotel chain. Instead of celebrating my professional achievement, the table fell into uncomfortable silence. Patricia managed a tight smile and offered lukewarm congratulations, while Carolyn made a comment about how demanding the project would probably be for our family life. William's response was the most telling. He questioned whether I had the experience to handle such a large account, and wondered aloud if the client understood they were working with a small local firm, rather than an established agency. When David defended my qualifications and track record, his father dismissed his support with a wave of his hand, saying young husbands often overestimated their wives' capabilities. That night, David and I had our most serious conversation about his family's behavior since we had married. I explained that the brief period of improved treatment felt artificial and unsustainable, and that I was tired of feeling like I had to earn basic respect from people who should have welcomed me as family. David's response was predictably defensive, accusing me of being ungrateful for his family's efforts to include me, and suggesting that I was looking for problems where none existed. When I pointed out specific examples of their continued condescension and undermining behavior, David's frustration became apparent. He accused me of being influenced by my father's legal mind and seeing manipulation where there was only normal family adjustment. The comment revealed more than he probably intended about his awareness of Dad's reputation and his discomfort with having someone in my corner who couldn't be intimidated or manipulated. The breaking point came during Caroline's birthday celebration the following month. The family had planned an elaborate dinner at Charleston's most exclusive restaurant, followed by a private party at the country club. As David's wife, I was expected to attend and contribute to the gift, a diamond tennis bracelet that cost more than most people's monthly salary. During the dinner, Caroline made a speech thanking everyone for their love and support throughout her life. She spoke eloquently about her parents' guidance, her brother's protection, and the family friends who had watched her grow up. When she mentioned David's wife in passing, it was with a comment about how different things had become since he married, and how the family was still adjusting to new dynamics and expectations. The implication was clear to everyone at the table. I was the disruptive element, the change that had complicated their previously harmonious family relationships. Several family friends nodded knowingly, and I realized that Caroline's comment reflected conversations that had been happening about me behind closed doors for months. Later that evening at the country club, I overheard a conversation that shattered any remaining illusions about my place in this family. Caroline was speaking with her Aunt Margaret and several family friends, discussing the challenges of maintaining family traditions when outsiders entered the picture. She spoke about the importance of protecting family values and ensuring that newcomers understood their role in preserving the Hartwell legacy. When one of the friends mentioned that I seemed nice enough, Caroline's response was devastating in its casual cruelty. She explained that niceness wasn't the issue, but that some people simply didn't understand the responsibilities that came with marrying into established families. She suggested that I was still learning about appropriate behavior and priorities, and that the family hoped I would eventually grow into the role of a Hartwell wife. The conversation continued with Margaret adding her own observations about generational differences and the importance of maintaining standards. She mentioned that David's previous girlfriends had been raised with similar values and expectations, making integration into family life much smoother. The implication was that I lacked the proper breeding and background to seamlessly fit into their world. Standing behind a pillar in the club's main room, listening to my character and worth being dissected by people who barely knew me, I felt something shift inside me permanently. The conditional respect that had emerged after Dad's intervention wasn't respect at all. It was simply a more sophisticated form of management, designed to control my behavior, while maintaining their fundamental belief that I was inferior and unwelcome. When I returned home that night, I called my father and asked him to meet me for breakfast the next morning. I needed his professional advice about my options, because I had finally accepted that this situation was never going to improve. David's family had made their position clear, and his continued refusal to acknowledge their behavior meant that I was fighting this battle alone. Dad listened carefully as I recounted the evening's events and my growing realization that the marriage was unsustainable. He asked thoughtful questions about my emotional state, my financial independence, and my clarity about what I wanted for my future. When I told him that I was considering divorce, he nodded slowly and began discussing the practical aspects of ending a marriage in South Carolina. His first question was about documentation, and I was grateful for the journal I had been keeping throughout the ordeal. Every incident of disrespect, manipulation, and exclusion was recorded with dates, witnesses, and detailed descriptions. Dad explained that while emotional abuse from in-laws wasn't grounds for divorce by itself, the pattern of behavior and David's failure to address it could support claims about the breakdown of the marriage relationship. More importantly, Dad outlined my rights regarding property division and spousal support. Since I had maintained my own business throughout the marriage and we had kept separate financial accounts for my consultancy, I was in a stronger position than many women facing divorce. My business assets were clearly separate property, and my earning potential meant I wouldn't be financially dependent on David or his family after the marriage ended. The conversation turned to strategy and timing. Dad recommended that I continue documenting incidents while quietly organizing my financial and legal affairs. He suggested consulting with a different attorney to handle my case, since his personal involvement might complicate proceedings. However, he assured me that his reputation and support would be factors that opposing counsel would have to consider in any negotiations. We discussed the possibility of attempting marriage counseling first, but Dad's assessment was pragmatic and somewhat pessimistic. He explained that counseling required both parties to acknowledge problems and commit to change. David's consistent pattern of denial and minimization suggested that he was unlikely to engage meaningfully in the process, especially if it required him to confront his family's behavior. Over the following weeks, I began preparing for the possibility of divorce, while giving my marriage one final opportunity to survive. I suggested couples counseling to David, framing it as a way to strengthen our communication and prepare for future challenges. His initial resistance was telling, but he eventually agreed after I made it clear that this was important for my sense of security in our relationship. Our first counseling session revealed the depth of our fundamental disconnect. When I described feeling unsupported and disrespected by his family, David's response was to minimize my experiences and suggest that I was being overly sensitive. When the counselor asked him to acknowledge my feelings without defending his family, he struggled to complete the exercise without adding qualifications and explanations. The counselor, Dr. Patricia Winslow, was an experienced family therapist who quickly identified the core issues in our relationship. She explained that healthy marriages required both partners to prioritize their relationship above extended family relationships, and that spouses had an obligation to protect each other from mistreatment regardless of the source. During our third session, Dr. Winslow asked David directly whether he believed his family's treatment of me was appropriate and respectful. His answer was a masterpiece of evasion and rationalization. He acknowledged that there might have been misunderstandings and communication issues, but insisted that his family meant well, and that I needed to make more effort to understand their perspective and traditions. When Dr. Winslow pressed him to give specific examples of efforts his family had made to welcome me or apologize for hurtful behavior, David couldn't provide any meaningful responses. The silence in the room was deafening, as he realized that his family had never actually tried to improve their relationship with me. They had simply expected me to accept their treatment and adapt to their expectations. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Winslow asked David to imagine how he would feel if my family treated him the way his family treated me. She walked him through hypothetical scenarios where my father questioned his worthiness, my relatives excluded him from conversations, and I consistently dismissed his concerns about their behavior. For the first time, David seemed to grasp the emotional impact of what I had been experiencing. However, understanding the problem and being willing to address it proved to be different things entirely. When Dr. Winslow outlined the changes that would be necessary to repair our marriage, including David setting clear boundaries with his family and insisting on respectful treatment for me, his resistance became apparent. He worried about damaging his relationships with his parents and sister, and questioned whether such dramatic changes were really necessary. After 6 weeks of counseling sessions, it became clear that David was unwilling or unable to make the fundamental changes that would be required to save our marriage. He wanted me to be more understanding of his family's position while they made minimal adjustments to accommodate my presence. He couldn't accept that the responsibility for change lay primarily with him and his family, not with me adapting to unacceptable treatment. The final counseling session was heartbreaking but clarifying. Dr. Winslow summarized her observations about our relationship dynamics and offered her professional assessment. She explained that marriages could survive family disapproval and interference, but only when both spouses were committed to protecting their relationship above all other considerations. In our case, David's unwillingness to prioritize our marriage over his family relationships made reconciliation unlikely. That evening, I told David that I wanted a separation. His shock and denial were immediate and overwhelming. He accused me of giving up too easily and not trying hard enough to make things work. When I explained that I had been trying for over 2 years while his family systematically undermined our relationship and he consistently failed to protect me, his response was to blame my father's influence and suggest that I was being manipulated by legal thinking rather than approaching our problems with love and patience. The irony of his accusation wasn't lost on me. He was claiming that my father's support and advocacy were harmful influences, while his own family's manipulation and mistreatment were simply misunderstood expressions of care. The double standard was so glaring that it crystallized my resolve about ending the marriage. David's family's reaction to news of our separation was swift and revealing. Within hours of David telling his parents, I received a phone call from Patricia expressing shock and concern about my decision. She offered to mediate between David and me, suggesting that young marriages often went through difficult periods that could be resolved with patience and compromise. When I explained that the problems weren't temporary difficulties, but fundamental incompatibilities, Patricia's tone shifted. She began lecturing me about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of putting family above personal feelings. The irony of receiving marriage advice from someone who had spent 2 years trying to undermine my marriage was almost laughable. Caroline's response was more direct and honest. She called to tell me that she wasn't surprised by my decision, since I had never really fit into their family anyway. She suggested that David would be better off with someone who understood his background and responsibilities, and that our divorce would ultimately be beneficial for everyone involved. Her honesty was refreshing after months of diplomatic manipulation. William's reaction was the most telling of all. He called to discuss the practical aspects of the separation, particularly regarding David's financial obligations and the protection of family assets. His primary concern wasn't the emotional impact on his son, but the potential financial implications of the divorce. When I assured him that I had no interest in claiming any Hartwell family assets or businesses, his relief was audible. As I prepared to move out of the house David and I had shared, I reflected on the journey that had brought me to this point. The marriage had failed not because of incompatible personalities or external pressures, but because of fundamental differences in values and priorities. David had chosen his family's approval over his wife's dignity, and I had finally chosen my self-respect over a relationship that required me to accept unacceptable treatment. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising efficiency. David's attorney, recommended by his father, seemed more interested in protecting the Hartwell family's reputation than in fighting for David's interests. My attorney, selected with Dad's guidance, was thorough and professional in ensuring that my rights were protected and my business interests remained separate from marital assets. During the settlement negotiations, the Hartwell family's true priorities became clear. They were willing to be generous with financial settlements as long as I agreed to confidentiality clauses that would prevent me from discussing the family's behavior publicly. The offer was substantial enough to ensure my financial security, but it came with strings attached that would have silenced me permanently about my experiences. Dad's advice during these negotiations was invaluable. He explained that accepting money in exchange for silence would validate the family's belief that their behavior was acceptable as long as they could afford to manage the consequences. More importantly, it would prevent me from sharing my story with other women who might be facing similar situations. I declined their generous offer and insisted on a straightforward property division that recognized my separate business assets and provided reasonable support during the transition period. The Hartwell family's disappointment with my decision was evident, but they couldn't argue with the fairness of the settlement or force me to accept their attempts to buy my silence. The divorce was finalized on a sunny Tuesday morning in October, exactly 1 year after Caroline's birthday dinner, where I had overheard the conversation that opened my eyes to my true place in the family. As I walked out of the courthouse with my attorney, I felt a profound sense of relief and freedom that I hadn't experienced in years. David's final attempt at reconciliation came 3 months after the divorce was finalized. He called to tell me that he had been reflecting on our marriage and counseling sessions, and that he finally understood some of the points I had been trying to make. He claimed that his family was willing to work on their relationship with me if I would consider giving our marriage another chance. My response was gentle but firm. I explained that understanding problems and being willing to address them were different things, and that the patterns we had established over 2 years couldn't be changed by good intentions alone. More importantly, I had discovered who I was when I wasn't constantly defending myself against manipulation and disrespect, and I wasn't willing to return to that environment. 6 months later, I received news through mutual friends that David was engaged to a woman from a prominent Charleston family, someone who fit perfectly into the Hartwell social circle and family expectations. The speed of his engagement confirmed my belief that our marriage had failed not because of insurmountable personal differences, but because I had never been the kind of wife his family wanted for him. My business flourished after the divorce, freed from the subtle sabotage and constant undermining that had affected my confidence and decision-making. I expanded my client base, hired additional staff, and eventually opened a second office in Atlanta. The success felt authentic and sustainable because it was built on my actual abilities, rather than constantly defending my worthiness to pursue professional goals. The relationship with my father deepened significantly through this experience. His willingness to support me unconditionally, even when it meant confronting powerful people who could have made his professional life difficult, taught me valuable lessons about loyalty and courage. More importantly, his example showed me what it looked like to be protected and valued by someone who truly cared about my well-being. Looking back now, 3 years after that Sunday morning when David's family first made their disapproval clear, I understand that their behavior was never really about me personally. It was about control, tradition, and the fear that David might choose his own path rather than following their expectations. I happen to represent independence and change, making me a threat to their established order, regardless of my actual character or qualifications. The experience taught me that respect cannot be earned from people who are fundamentally unwilling to give it, and that no amount of accommodation or self-sacrifice will change minds that are closed to changing. More importantly, I learned that standing up for myself didn't require becoming confrontational or aggressive. It simply required refusing to accept unacceptable treatment and being willing to face the consequences of that refusal. My father's intervention had been crucial, not because it forced the Hartwell family to respect me, but because it showed me what real support looked like and gave me the confidence to demand better treatment. The temporary change in their behavior had been revealing precisely because it demonstrated that they were capable of treating me well when they feared consequences for their actions. Today, I live in a beautiful historic home in Charleston's French Quarter, within walking distance of my thriving business and a community of friends who value and support my goals. I've dated occasionally but haven't felt pressured to remarry quickly or settle for relationships that require me to diminish myself. The peace and authenticity of my current life stand in stark contrast to the constant stress and self-doubt that characterized my marriage. Sometimes I wonder if David ever truly understood what went wrong in our relationship, or if he simply moved on to a situation that better matched his family's expectations. I hope he found happiness with someone who fits more naturally into his world, just as I found peace in creating a life that reflects my own values and priorities. The most important lesson from this experience is that family dynamics, whether biological or chosen, should enhance rather than diminish the people involved. When relationships consistently require someone to accept disrespect or abandon their authentic self, they are fundamentally unhealthy, regardless of the social expectations or financial benefits they might provide. My story isn't unique, unfortunately. Many women face similar challenges when they marry into families that view them as threats, rather than additions to their circle. The key to surviving and thriving through such situations is recognizing that the problem lies with the people doing the rejecting, not with the person being rejected. No one should have to earn basic respect and courtesy from people who claim to care about their family members' happiness. The support of people who truly value you makes all the difference in these situations. Whether it's a parent, friend, mentor, or professional counselor, having someone in your corner who can see the situation clearly and offer both emotional support and practical guidance is invaluable. Don't underestimate the power of having allies who refuse to let you accept unacceptable treatment. Most importantly, trust your instincts about how you're being treated. If you feel consistently diminished, excluded, or disrespected in family or social situations, pay attention to those feelings. They're usually accurate indicators of problematic dynamics, even when other people minimize or dismiss your concerns. Your emotional well-being matters, and protecting it sometimes requires making difficult decisions about relationships and situations that aren't serving your best interests. The strength to stand up for yourself often comes from understanding your own worth, independent of other people's opinions or approval. Building a life based on your own values and goals, rather than trying to meet other people's expectations, creates the foundation for genuine confidence and peace. When you know who you are and what you bring to relationships, it becomes much easier to recognize and reject situations that don't honor your inherent dignity and worth. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.